November 1943 found the war in the Pacific still yet undecided. Although the Allies had achieved several significant victories by this time, Japan's outer defensive barrier had not yet been effectively penetrated. The initial phase of Japanese expansion is one of the greatest episodes of conquest in all of military history. Through their crushing victories at Pearl Harbor, Singapore, and the Philippines, Imperial Japan had, in just 3 months of campaigning, conquered an area the size of Europe. For Japan, the primary aim of the war in the Pacific was always about achieving resource independence. Despite Tokyo's growing industrial might, the home islands lacked many crucial resources upon which the domestic economy fed, perhaps the most important of which was oil. The US oil embargo was crippling. At a stroke of the pen, Roosevelt had removed 80% of Japan's crude oil and petroleum imports. Imperial General Headquarters calculated that it only had 2 years of bunker oil storage to support fleet operations, after which Japan would no longer be a major naval power. Given these serious economic constraints, Tokyo decided to take on the immense risk of war with the Western powers. With its conquest of Borneo and Malaya, Japan now had all the rubber, oil, and tin it required to sustain its industrial production and fleet operations, ridding itself of the need for foreign imports of critical resources. Although Tokyo had finally rid itself of the economic leverage Washington had utilized to such decisive effect, it now faced a much greater problem. Japan was now at war with the United States and the British Empire in addition to China. A counterattack was inevitable, and thus a strong defensive barrier had to be erected. The primary Japanese strategy for the Pacific War was to impose such devastating casualties on the Western Allies that they would be compelled to accept a compromised peace that left Japan in control of the southern resource area, forever ridding it of the need to rely on the Western powers for resource imports. Therefore, although attrition favoured the materially superior Western Allies, it also favoured the Japanese. In effect, Japan was betting on its ability to simply bear a far greater level of sacrifice than the democracies, a function of the fundamental solidity of Japanese society. But in order to achieve this political objective, Japan required strategic depth, which could be traded for both time and allied blood once the defensive phase of the war had begun. Thus, although Japan's strategic objectives were Borneo and Malaya, Tokyo drove its defensive perimeter 5,000 kilometers to the east. This great wave of expansion broke upon the skillful and dogged Australian resistance in Papua, leading to the destruction of the elite South Seas Force, and the Allied counter-offensive had begun in the Solomon Islands with the American landing at Guadalcanal. The Japanese defensive position in the east rested upon 2 major island bases, Rabaul and Truk. Originally an Australian town located on the island of New Britain, Rabaul fell to the Japanese in early 1942. Featuring one of the best harbours in the Bismarck archipelago and ready airfield facilities, the Japanese quickly turned Rabaul into a nearly impregnable fortress. The base not only served as the headquarters of the 8th Area Army, but it was the nexus of all Japanese operations in the Papua, New Guinea, and Solomon Islands theatres. 1,000 kilometers to the north of Rabaul was the great naval base at Truk Lagoon. Serving as the primary forward operating base for IJN fleet operations, Truk was effectively Japan's Pearl Harbor. The massive lagoon not only provided a huge anchorage area for the IJN's major fleet units, but Japan had built extensive facilities in the surrounding islands, including air bases, fuel and munition storage and repair facilities. Truk was the key to major IJN operations in the South and Central Pacific areas, and by early 1943, Japanese naval forces based there were estimated to consist of 6 battleships, 2 aircraft carriers, 15 cruisers, approximately 40 destroyers, and 27 submarines. For the first 2 years of the war, the focus of both sides had been on the area surrounding Rabaul. In the first half of 1942, the Japanese had focused their attention on the capture of Port Moresby, the only other major town and base area in Papua, New Guinea, or the Solomons. Several Japanese offensives against the town led to a number of decisive battles. An amphibious operation was thwarted at the Battle of the Coral Sea, and 2 land offensives were decisively defeated by Australian forces at Milne Bay and Kokoda. As desperate battle raged in the Papuan Mountains, the Americans began the first major engagement of the Solomon Islands campaign. The construction of an airbase on the island of Guadalcanal threatened to sever the sea lines of communication between the United States and Australia. Reacting to the threat, the 1st Marine Division took the airbase by a surprise amphibious assault. For 6 months, intense air, land, and naval battle raged in and around the island, as both sides desperately tried to gain sea control and reinforce their ground elements. By the beginning of 1943, General Hyakutake of the 17th Japanese Army was forced to admit defeat, abandoning Guadalcanal to the Americans. For nearly all of 1942, the Papuan and Guadalcanal campaigns had raged in bloody unison, and with the simultaneous victories, the Allies were, by the opening months of 1943, finally ready to begin large-scale offensive operations. The bulk of Allied combat power was still concentrated in the south. There were 3 primary theatre commands in the Pacific: the South Pacific Area, Central Pacific Area, and Southwest Pacific Area. Under the command of Admiral William Bull Halsey, the South Pacific Theatre included New Zealand and the Solomon Islands. Here Halsey led a powerful and balanced force. His land forces were composed of 7 divisions, 2 US Marine, 4 US Army, and 1 New Zealand division. His naval strength was even more formidable: 6 battleships, 2 aircraft carriers, 3 escort carriers, 13 cruisers, approximately 50 destroyers, and numerous smaller ships and submarines. 350 carrier-based aircraft and 500 land-based aircraft of the 13th American Air Force and the Royal New Zealand Air Force completed Halsey's force, described by the American naval historian S.E. Morrison as a well-oiled fighting machine, strong in all 3 elements. The second major Pacific Theatre Command was the Southwest Pacific Area under the command of General Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur's land and air forces were both large and formidable. Here the Allies deployed some 15 divisions, 12 Australian and 3 American, arranged in 3 field armies, the 1st and 2nd Australian Armies and the 6th US Army. Allied air power in the Southwest Pacific was no less formidable, with over 3,000 combat aircraft in the theatre, roughly equally split between the US 5th Air Force and Royal Australian Air Force. MacArthur's impressive-sounding 7th Fleet was, however, little more than a ragtag conglomeration of various minor Australian, American, and Dutch vessels, the largest of which were the cruisers HMAS Australia and USS Phoenix. With so much Allied combat power concentrated in the south, some 22 divisions and well over 4,000 combat aircraft in all, it is obvious why Rabaul was selected as the first major target for 1943. To oversee these operations, MacArthur was placed in overall command, although Halsey still retained his theatre command. His plan for the 1943 operation was called Elkerton 3, although it is perhaps better known by its later codename, Operation Cartwheel. One of MacArthur's best operational concepts, Elkerton involved a great pincer attack on Rabaul by simultaneous offensives on its left and right flank. The objective was never to take Rabaul, but simply to isolate it and to establish air bases that would bring it within fighter and medium bomber range. The right flank advance would be conducted by Halsey's South Pacific forces. Their objective was the establishment of air bases on the island of Bougainville. The main effort would be made on the left flank by a New Guinea force under the command of General Thomas Blamey. Predominantly an Australian formation, New Guinea forces' objective was to clear the main Japanese defensive areas at Salamaua, Lae, the Huon Peninsula and Madang. With the Japanese defences in New Guinea breached, the path would be open to MacArthur's real objective, the Philippines. Although necessity and Japanese dispositions in 1942 had pulled the locus of the Pacific War to Australia's periphery, an offensive in the Central Pacific area would pose a dire strategic threat to the Japanese. Nonetheless, apart from the great American naval victory at Midway, Admiral Chester Nimitz's Central Pacific area had been somewhat of a strategic backwater throughout the first 2 years of the war. As both Japanese and US naval assets had been pulled into the great destructive vortex of the naval Battle of Guadalcanal, and Japanese land strength was being diverted to the defense of New Guinea, the potential of an offensive in the Central Pacific languished. One of the major limiting factors tying Nimitz's hands was the relative weakness of US naval power. Major offensives in New Guinea could be supported purely by Allied air power, but this was not the case in the Central Pacific. Although miraculously the carrier force had been spared from slaughter at Pearl Harbor, and Nimitz's brilliancy at Midway had re-established parity between USN and IJN carrier forces, in early 1943, by and large, the navy the United States entered the war with had been completely destroyed. Of the 7 fleet carriers the USN possessed in 1941, only 3 were still afloat, as Yorktown, Lexington, Wasp, and Hornet had all been lost to enemy action. Of the remaining 3, only Saratoga was operational in the battle area, with Enterprise undergoing repair and refit and Ranger retained in the Atlantic Fleet. Thus, there were simply not enough assets to support the ongoing Solomon Islands campaign in addition to a Central Pacific offensive. This balance of forces, however, began to irrevocably shift in mid-1943. It had taken nearly 2 years before the immense latent power of the United States began to manifest itself on the waters of the Pacific Ocean. With the exception of the Navy, the United States was not a truly great military power in 1941. However, by mid-1943 it was clearly becoming a superpower. Arguably, there was no greater symbol of this transition than the mighty Essex-class fleet carriers. Truly the supercarriers of the Second World War, the Essex class was some 250 metres long, displaced 30,000 tonnes at a relatively typical load, and could deploy a 100-strong air group. Bristling with anti-aircraft armament, at commission USS Essex was protected by 10 dual-purpose 5-inch guns, 32 40mm Bofors, and 46 20mm Oerlikon autocannons. Not only were the Essex class amongst the most capable aircraft carriers of the war, they were procured in colossal numbers. No fewer than 32 units were ordered, although only 24 would be commissioned. As Imperial Japan struggled to rebuild the fleet it had lost in the vicious battles of 1942, the United States was busy constructing a navy that was, at least in terms of carrier air power, 5 times its pre-war strength. It was not only the new American carriers that were far more capable, but the aircraft they deployed. By mid-1943, a new generation of carrier fighter was adorning the USN's flat tops, the legendary F-6F Hellcat. An evolutionary replacement for the venerable F-4F Wildcat, a fighter that had, contrary to popular opinion, given a good account of itself in engagements with the Japanese A6M0 throughout 1942, the Hellcat was specifically designed to achieve a decisive performance advantage over its primary opponent. In fact, the design was altered once a fully intact A6M2 was recovered in the Aleutian Islands, allowing for a thorough analysis of the aircraft. Powered by the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp radial engine, which, when supercharged, developed 2,200 horsepower, the Hellcat enjoyed a decisive kinematic advantage over the A6M2. The top speed advantage, combined with its tremendous dive speed, good armor protection and increased firepower, provided the foundation for the development of a set of tactics that would allow the F-6F to achieve, by some estimates, a 14-to-1 kill ratio. The superior speed allowed the American pilot to dictate the terms of the engagement. The A6M2, or in fact practically any of its Japanese contemporaries, could outmaneuver a Hellcat in a turning fight. Nevertheless, the superior speed of the F-6F meant it could decline a maneuvering fight as long as it had any altitude available to perform a dive. When the tables were reversed and the Zero was defensive, it simply could not disengage in the same way, allowing the use of boom and zoom attacks by the Hellcat. Any Zero with an energy deficit was essentially a sitting duck for an F-6F. By the third quarter of 1943, the strength of the USN's carrier forces were beginning to attain critical mass. 4 of the new Essex class were now under Nimitz's operational command: USS Essex, Yorktown, Lexington, and Bunker Hill, in addition to the Yorktown-class Enterprise and Lexington-class Saratoga. These 6 fleet carriers were now supplemented by a growing number of light carriers of the Independence class. Adapted from the hull of the Cleveland-class light cruiser, the 10 to 15,000 ton Independence class was a key component of the USN's fast carrier task force. Although far less capable than the mighty Essex, the Independence could be manufactured much more quickly, providing the USN with essential mass while the larger carriers were still only available in small numbers. Critically, and unlike escort carriers, they had the speed to keep up with the big flat tops. Each Independence class would typically deploy 2 squadrons of fighters and a single squadron of dive bombers, around 35 aircraft in total. They were, however, much less well protected than the large fleet carriers. 6 of these warships were now available in the Central Pacific Theatre. With this powerful new naval force operational and the abatement of naval battle in the Solomons, the conditions were now ripe for the commencement of offensive operations in the Central Pacific. The Central Pacific Theatre is a vast area of maritime geography. The endless Pacific Ocean is only punctuated by tiny atolls and the occasional more substantial island. These atolls are loosely organised into island groups that run in a roughly east-west direction for over 4,000 kilometres from the Marianas in the west through the Caroline Islands, where the Great Base of Truk was located, and out into the Gilbert and Marshall Islands. Despite the lack of land, population, industry and infrastructure in the theatre, an offensive here did hold the prospect of providing substantial strategic dividends. The most proximate objective was Truk. If the great Japanese base could be isolated, then the threat of major combined fleet operations in the southern battle area would have effectively been removed. Additionally, if this area was taken, the hard-pressed Japanese 8th Area Army in Rabaul would be cut off from any hope of major resupply or reinforcement. Finally, and most critically, if the Mariana Islands could be taken, then the Japanese home islands would be within range of US strategic air power, especially the revolutionary B-29 superfortress that was only just reaching operational status. On the 20th of July, the Joint Chiefs of Staff met to discuss the coming offensive. Marshall, King and Arnold were all supportive of the commencement of a drive across the Central Pacific. However, MacArthur expressed significant concern that any offensive in this area would only be a distraction from his operations. Marshall and King were unmoved by these concerns, the former noting that the United States should not let its now great carrier forces sit idle. That day, Admiral Nimitz, commander of the Central Pacific Theatre, received the following orders. He was to organise and train necessary forces to capture, occupy, defend, and develop bases in the Gilbert Group and Nauru. One foundational concept which is key to understanding the Pacific War in any of the 3 major theatres was that all operations revolved around the possession of air bases. Each of these tiny atolls could be turned into a small unsinkable aircraft carrier, one that would provide a bubble of sea denial around it. Not only could the land-based fighters and bombers interfere with enemy resupply efforts, but perhaps more importantly they provided the whole theatre with invaluable reconnaissance. Just finding ships in the vast Pacific Ocean was a serious challenge, but the routine surveillance flights from these small island bases meant that any large-scale action by enemy main fleet units was likely to be detected, allowing for the concentration of available carrier forces to meet the threat. This also meant that many islands that were held by Japanese could simply be bypassed if the United States could seize and develop a major airbase in the area. The Gilbert Islands were a logical first step. Located about halfway between New Guinea and Hawaii, the Gilberts represented Japan's outer defense perimeter. Although they were not, in and of themselves, strategically important, establishing bases in this island chain was a prerequisite for operations in the Marshall and Caroline Islands, which would pose a severe threat to Truk. The Gilbert Island group contains a number of picturesque Pacific Island atolls, thin crusts of land which surround a large tranquil lagoon, each adorned with coconut palm groves. These tiny islands would not allow any operational depth for Japanese garrisons, making any form of significant tactical withdrawal a practical impossibility. However, this would also mean that the invading forces would land right on top of the Japanese defences, ensuring viciously intimate combat between the two forces. In fact, these little slices of paradise would witness some of the most horrific combat of the Second World War. The forces allocated for the Gilbert's offensive, now codenamed Operation Galvanic, were an indication of the kind of naval power the United States was quickly turning into. Although local naval and air defences were not considered to be substantial, in late 1943 the Imperial Japanese Navy still had a formidable battle line, especially its big gun capital ships. To ensure that any IJN counterstroke would be met with adequate force, all USN battle forces in the Central Pacific area were made available to Nimitz. The Joint Chiefs estimated that Operation Galvanic would require a force of 5 modern fast battleships, 7 old battleships for shore bombardment, 12 cruisers and 37 troop transports and other amphibious and support ships, in addition to dozens of destroyers. A grand total of 17 aircraft carriers were allocated to cover the operation, with 6 large fleet carriers, 4 of which were the new Essex class, 4 Independence-class light carriers, which would eventually increase to 6, and 7 escort carriers. Escort carriers were similar in concept to the Independence-class light carriers. These were much smaller vessels in the 8 to 12,000 ton range, each of which deployed an air group of between 25 to 30 aircraft. However, unlike the Independence class, which was built off the hull of a light cruiser, escort carriers were based on commercial vessels, such as the C-3 cargo or Liberty ship. This made them far too slow to operate with the fast carrier task force, but it also made them both very inexpensive and quick to manufacture. By far the most prolific in American service were the Bogue and Casablanca classes, the latter of which was hitting the water just 90 days after having the keel laid. Nevertheless, these small and slow carriers were very well suited to providing the equally slow amphibious forces with air defense and close air support for deployed forces. In comparison to the colossal naval forces allocated for Operation Galvanic, the land forces were reasonably small. Perhaps a symptom of the persistent inter-service rivalry between the Army and the Navy, Admiral King proposed that the 1st and 3rd Marine Divisions should be removed from MacArthur's command and used in the Central Pacific, arguing that these units not only had the training and doctrine to undertake the amphibious campaign being proposed, but that mixed forces should be avoided. From the beginning of the war, King had been attempting to make the Central Pacific an almost exclusive possession of the United States Navy. Indeed, it seems as though King considered the concept of jointness to be a vice rather than a virtue. Marshall responded that the reallocation of 2 divisions from MacArthur's command would cause significant shipping disruption, in addition to negatively impacting Operation Cartwheel. In response, he offered the 27th Infantry Division, which was currently serving as the Hawaii garrison. A National Guard division, the 27th had received no amphibious training thus far, but Marshall was sure that with several months to prepare, it would be ready by November. Combined with the 2nd Marine Division, the 27th formed the 5th Amphibious Corps, the headquarters of which would be raised in August 1943, and commanded by Major General Holland M. Smith, United States Marine Corps. The original concept for Operation Galvanic included a pair of simultaneous assaults on Tarawa Atoll and the island of Nauru. The 27th Division had been allocated the task of taking Nauru, but after thorough consideration it was decided that the whole operational plan had to be revised. Nauru was relatively heavily defended and posed several substantial hazards to an amphibious landing. In addition, the island is some 700 kilometers to the west of Tarawa, meaning the covering and close support forces would, by necessity, have to be divided between the 2 operations. With the blessing of Admiral Nimitz and Major General Smith, the operational objective was changed to Makin Atoll, just 170 kilometers to the north of Tarawa. Considering the fundamental objective of the Gilbert's operation was the establishment of air and naval facilities to support the drive into the Marshall Islands, it was decided that the far less heavily defended Makin Atoll would probably achieve the same strategic purpose at far less cost. Now, the whole weight of the covering force could be rapidly shifted between the 2 operations depending on operational requirements. The responsibility for detailed operational planning for the 2 landings fell upon the 2 divisional headquarters. Although this arrangement made some practical sense, as each division was essentially conducting a separate operation, it also led to 2 very different tactical plans. Makin is a triangular-shaped atoll enclosing a lagoon which is about 30 kilometers in width. There are 2 main islands which make up the southern edge of the atoll, Butaritari and Kuma, with the main Japanese defences and installations concentrated on Butaritari. The island is 18 kilometers long and at places just 300 meters wide, with a more expansive area on its far western tip. The Japanese garrison on Butaritari was estimated to be between 500 to 800 troops, consisting of 1 rifle company, 1 field battery of 4 heavy anti-aircraft guns, and 2 anti-aircraft machine gun batteries totaling 4 medium anti-aircraft guns and 20 machine guns. The defenders had contracted their primary defensive area into a box about 2 kilometers wide in the narrow part of the island. On its eastern and western landward approaches, the Japanese had dug a pair of tank barriers, a trench about 2 meters deep and 5 meters wide, which had been extended by log fences. This obstacle was thought to be covered by heavy weapons emplacements including numerous anti-tank guns. For General Ralph Smith, the commanding officer of the 27th Division, the western tank barrier was the primary challenge that would prevent a rapid exploitation by the landing forces, and thus his entire operational plan revolved around its capture. Smith's plan was, in the words of the US official history, elaborate in the extreme. The forces allocated to the operation were primarily the 165th Regimental Combat Team with its attached units, a formation with a final strength of 6,470 men. Allocated to the 165th were detachments from the 105th Infantry Regiment, part of the 193rd Tank Battalion, and the 152nd Engineer Battalion. The first phase of the operation would involve the lodgement of 2 battalion landing teams on the west coast of Butari from the ocean, followed by armour and artillery elements. This landing would be outside of the Japanese defensive box. 2 hours later, a 3rd battalion landing team would be landed on the far side of the western tank barrier. This landing would be staged from the lagoon. The 3rd battalion would then divide its forces, with 2 companies advancing towards the tank barrier, enveloping it by an elaborate amphibious pincer movement. Once the forces had linked up, they would clear the main Japanese positions to the east. These landings would be supported by the simultaneous lodgement of the core recon element on tiny Kobatu Island in order to secure the approaches into the lagoon. This plan had serious weaknesses and was only reluctantly approved by General Holland Smith, the corps commander. Not only did the elaborate timetable of landings on multiple beaches increase the likelihood of confusion, it involved 2 infantry battalions advancing directly towards each other. Clearly, the danger of a large-scale firefight between US forces was a very real one. Both battalions were ordered to use coloured smoke to mark their positions and maintain close communications. What General Ralph Smith had evidently not really considered was the possibility that radio communications between the various battalions may not be reliable. He had also clearly overestimated the danger the tank barrier posed. Yes, in theory, it could hinder the movement of tank infantry teams, but a feature this large was very vulnerable to air and naval fire support. In fact, because of its position, the tank barrier was very vulnerable to enfilading fire from a destroyer that could approach close to shore. The plan for the landing of the 2nd Marine Division on Tarawa was, again in the words of the US official history, a model of simplicity. Much like Makin, Tarawa is a triangle-shaped atoll with small islands enclosing a shallow lagoon. It is about 35 kilometers in width from north to south. The primary Japanese defences were concentrated on the island of Betio in the southwestern corner of the atoll. The plan for the landing was composed by another General Smith, General Julian Smith, commanding officer of the 2nd Marine Division. Smith's operational concept involved the landing of 3 battalion landing teams on 1 regimental front. On the left was the 2nd Battalion 8th Marines. In the centre was the 2nd Battalion 2nd Marines, and on the right was the 3rd Battalion 2nd Marines. The 1st Battalion 2nd Marines was to act as the regimental reserve and could be landed at any of the 3 beaches, although all were connected. The landings would be made on the north coast of Betio from the lagoon. The 1st and 3rd Battalions of the 8th Marines would act as a division reserve, and could be landed wherever the situation demanded. This was a simple, flexible, and well-conceived plan, but as events would show, the Marines faced a far tougher task on Betio, especially as one of the division's regiments, the 6th, was designated as a corps reserve and was thus not available. Betio was a far more heavily defended Japanese position than Butari. US intelligence estimated Japanese strength on the island as 2,500 to 3,100 personnel, and aerial photography had revealed an elaborate series of Japanese entrenchments. A complex trench network consisting of rifle pits, machine gun positions, coastal and anti-aircraft guns, and defensive obstacles arranged in considerable depth. This tiny island, just 4 kilometers long and 600 meters wide, contained an estimated 8 coastal defense guns, 12 heavy anti-aircraft guns of at least 75mm, 12 40mm medium anti-aircraft guns, 40 heavy weapon positions, and 52 light weapons such as machine guns. The daunting challenge facing the Marines was magnified by the forces at their disposal. Despite their overwhelming fire superiority, the landing forces enjoyed a 2-to-1 force ratio, far less than the 3-to-1 margin generally considered desirable for contested amphibious operations. If the preliminary bombardment proved to be less effective than hoped, then the fighting troops would shoulder a very heavy burden indeed. The shore bombardment fire plan was extremely impressive in scale. The level of naval firepower available to support the 5th Amphibious Corps was something never before witnessed, especially when one considers the small size of the target islands. On D-Day, hundreds of carrier aircraft would strike the islands from 0545, attacking coastal defense guns, anti-aircraft guns, barracks, and any other inland installations. Then, just 5 minutes before H hour, the weight of the air attack would switch to the invasion beaches themselves. 20 minutes after the first waves had landed, the aircraft would shift their fire to the flanks of the landings, bombing and strafing targets 1,000 yards from the beaches. Naval gunfire support was no less impressive. For shore bombardment duties, 4 old battleships, 4 cruisers, and 6 destroyers would support the Makin landings. At Tarawa, 3 battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, 3 light cruisers, and 9 destroyers would be assigned to this duty. Battleships and heavy cruisers were authorized to approach to just 2,000 meters from the shore in order to direct their fire accurately, and destroyers could move into just over half that distance. Hopes were high that such a concentration of fire just before the landings would eliminate the shore defenses. As the 2nd Marines were departing for the operation, one high-ranking naval officer is reported to have said of Betio, "We do not intend to neutralize it. We do not intend to destroy it. Gentlemen, we will obliterate it." Unfortunately, for the young Marines headed for Tarawa, such optimism was unjustified. Undeniably, the greatest weakness in the planning for both the Makin and Tarawa operations was the evaluation of local tidal conditions. Both Butaritari and Betio are surrounded by a shallow coral reef. At Betio, on the ocean-facing sides, this reef extends between 500 meters to a kilometer offshore, and at places in the lagoon, the reef is several thousand meters wide. Makin Atoll is perhaps less formidable, with the reef extending a couple of hundred meters from shore. For some of the landing craft, this was no problem. The LVTs, or amphibious vehicle tracked, were easily capable of advancing over the reef no matter how shallow the waterline. Essentially boats with tank tracks, these vessels could drive on land just as easily as motor across water. However, the major problem was the lack of these vehicles. At both Makin and Tarawa, a large portion of the assaulting infantry would have to be landed by LCVPs, or Higgins boats. These boats were the most common form of minor landing craft used by the Western Allies. They were very useful vessels, but their critical shortcoming was their draft. When fully loaded, each Higgins boat would have a draft of around a meter, meaning there had to be at least that much water over the reef if these vessels were going to be able to reach the beach. This problem was complicated by the fact that the date of the landings, the 20th of November, was a neap tide, meaning the difference between high and low tide would be at its smallest. In forming the operational concept for the 2 landings, the 5th Amphibious Corps was provided with a reasonably comprehensive intelligence assessment, which included aerial photography of the beaches, close-range images taken by submarine, and the input of various people who knew the islands well, including Lieutenant Commander Gerhard Hayen, Royal Australian Navy, who had lived on Makin Atoll for a time. These produced accurate intelligence on the probable tides at both Makin and Tarawa. Admiral Turner's intelligence staff made a correct evaluation of the tides at the landing beaches, stating that during high water neap tides, the reef off the north coast of Betio is covered by 1 to 2 feet of water. Similar evaluations were made for Makin. The unavoidable consequence of this information is that even for the attacking force at Butaritari, where the reefs are certainly less formidable, the Higgins boats would run aground around 150 meters from the shoreline. This would occur at an even further distance at Tarawa. Considering this assessment originated from Admiral Turner's staff, the commander of the assault force, it was surely available to both divisional headquarters. It was either ignored or not properly understood, as both the 27th and 2nd Divisional plans envisaged the rapid lodgement of forces by LCVPs directly on the beach. In fact, no particular difficulties from tidal or hydrographical conditions were envisaged by 27th Division planners, who believed that a Higgins boat could land directly on the beach anywhere on the island for a 2-hour period during high water. These would prove to be very costly mistakes. The Japanese forces on Makin and Tarawa had been preparing for an Allied offensive in this area for some time. Stung by a raid conducted by the 2nd Marine Raider Battalion on Makin during August 1942, the Japanese garrison in the Gilbert Islands had been increased substantially. Nauru, Ocean Island, and Apamama were rapidly occupied by Japanese forces. Base and garrison units were transferred from Saipan, Truk, and even Japan, including the 3rd Special Base Force, but the main defensive capability in the area came from the 1,509 Japanese Marines of the Yokosuka 6th Special Naval Landing Force, which was transferred directly from Japan. The Special Naval Landing Forces, essentially overstrength Marine battalions, were very high-quality infantry formations. On the 1st of January 1943, the Japanese began shipping 4th Fleet labourers, mostly Koreans, to the Gilberts. These allowed for the construction of complex and deep fortifications all across the archipelago, which were most formidable on Tarawa. By May 1943, the increasing Allied threat in the Central Pacific precipitated the deployment of the battle-hardened Sasebo 7th Special Naval Landing Force from Rabaul to Tarawa. Although elements of this formation had been badly mauled by the Australians at Milne Bay, in the preceding 12 months it had been reconstituted and was now an experienced and highly capable force. As the invasion task force began to assemble in November, Makin and Tarawa had been transformed into island fortresses, complete with well-constructed fortifications, manned, at least partially, by highly trained, motivated, and experienced Japanese Marines. Operation Galvanic began with a series of airstrikes on Japanese installations in the area on the 18th and 19th of September. These only caused minimal damage to the defensive complex on both of the target islands, however other important installations were badly disrupted. Critically, Japanese reconnaissance capability in the Gilberts was crippled. The seaplane base on Nauru was devastated, and almost all of the 18 aircraft stationed at Tarawa were destroyed. This had an immediate impact. At Truk, a powerful RJN striking force was waiting for an American offensive in this area. Under Admiral Minichi Koga, waiting at Truk Lagoon was the main battle force of the combined fleet, the super battleships Yamato and Musashi, 2 older battleships and a destroyer flotilla. Also available to Koga were the forces of the 2nd and 3rd Fleets, which deployed 3 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 11 heavy and 3 light cruisers, and a large number of destroyers. Koga had been holding this powerful force in reserve, with the objective of striking the Americans once they showed their hand. He had no idea where they would attack next, but he was sure a blow would land somewhere. During September and October, this powerful fleet sortied from Truk in response to reports of US carrier forces in the Marshall and Gilbert Islands, but without effective reconnaissance he never came close to intercepting the US task forces. Koga was immediately distracted by events in the Solomons. In response to continued Allied pressure in the southern battle area, large elements of the 2nd and 3rd Fleets were diverted to Rabaul to try and redress the rapidly deteriorating Japanese position. In a desperate attempt to alter the course of the air battle, on the 1st of November, virtually all of the carrier aircraft left their ships at Truk and flew to Rabaul. The force was immediately engaged in battle by the US 5th Air Force. Of the 173 aircraft that departed Truk, 121 were destroyed in 3 massive air battles. This short-sighted act of desperation had effectively neutered Carrier Division 1, robbing Koga of any hope of carrier air cover for a counterstroke in the Central Pacific. A similar story is true of his surface forces. In response to the US landing on Bougainville, Koga dispatched a large task force to Rabaul. This formation was caught by the carrier air group of Rear Admiral Frederick C. Sherman's fast carrier force, Task Force 38. In the ensuing battle, 4 of his heavy cruisers were so badly damaged as to be inoperable for months. 2 more had suffered a similar fate in surface engagements around Bougainville. The various theatres of the Pacific War were certainly showing their mutual dependence and support. The powerful battle force Koga had been carefully husbanding to parry the thrust Nimitz was planning had been drawn into battle around Rabaul and savaged by MacArthur and Halsey's forces. It was now a shell of its former self, robbed of its long-range striking power by the decimation of its carrier air groups. The Japanese defenders at Tarawa and Makin would now have to face this most powerful enemy without any hope of meaningful naval support. As the sun rose on the morning of the 20th of November, 1943, the ships of Admiral Turner's Northern Attack Force came into view of Makin Atoll, a picturesque paradise of white sandy beaches, coconut trees, and crystal-clear blue water, only gently disturbed by a 13-knot southwesterly wind. Waiting for them there were the men of Lieutenant Shizo Ishikawa's 3rd Special Base Force, Makin Detachment. Its strength was 798 officers and men, although the majority of these were non-combat forces. 414 Korean labourers and 100 air personnel who had been marooned on the island when their aircraft had been destroyed. Only the 284-strong 3rd Special Base Force were dedicated combat troops. The labourers and aircrew had all been armed, but their combat capability was minimal. Thus, Ishikawa only had 384 Japanese soldiers with which to face the combined force of the 165th Regimental Combat Team, a third of which were not trained infantry. His defences were also far less formidable than those enjoyed by the Tarawa garrison. The northern flank, facing the lagoon, was only protected by 3 8cm dual-purpose anti-aircraft guns and a small number of machine gun positions. The main strength of the Japanese fortifications were the tank trenches, but even the western tank barrier was only covered by a single anti-tank gun, far less than General Smith had estimated. Infantry defences were more formidable here, altogether a total of 1 concrete pillbox, 6 machine gun positions, and 50 rifle pits covered the barrier. The battle opened with an awesome display of American firepower. For 2 hours, aircraft and warships took their turns battering the island in a well-choreographed ballet of destruction. From 6:10 to 6:40, hundreds of aircraft bombed and strafed the island in waves. As they withdrew to rearm, the 14-inch guns of the battleships Pennsylvania, New Mexico, Mississippi, and Idaho plastered the Japanese positions, supported by the fire of 4 heavy cruisers. Although the beach defences and tank obstacles escaped catastrophic damage, in some areas the Japanese defensive system was devastated. Just inside the western tank barrier was a network of shallow trenches and fighting positions. Aerial reconnaissance revealed the devastation this area had suffered. The trench system itself had taken a direct hit from a 2,000-pound bomb, and the thick coconut grove had caused many of the incoming shells to airburst. 62 Japanese men were found dead in this area, many of them torn to pieces by the effects of 14-inch airbursts. At Yellow Beach, on the lagoon, the 3 8cm anti-aircraft guns were all destroyed by air attack, and here 25 men were found dead, killed purely by the concussion of 2,000-pound bombs. Off Red Beach, as Butari Tari was drenched in high explosive, the men of the first attack wave had all entered their LVTs, or amphibious tractors. These strange vehicles were now in the water, and at 7:50 the order was given to advance. The LVTs formed 2 inverted Vs, like an arrow formation, and headed for the island. To their flanks, the destroyers Phelps and McDonough accompanied the men in, covering the beaches with 5-inch gunfire. The second wave came in immediately behind the amphibious tractors, composed of the main body of the 1st and 3rd Battalion landing teams. As there were not enough LVTs available, these men had to use Higgins boats. Covered by the fire of the destroyers and their own 50 caliber machine guns, the tractors approached the beach. About 40 meters offshore, the LVTs made contact with the reef, their tracks dragging the lumbering vehicles out of the water and onto the rocks like green crocodiles, hauling them up onto the beach. As the men jumped over the sides, many of them stood stunned by the lack of enemy fire. Major Edward T. Bratt, commanding the 3rd Battalion of the 105th Infantry, later described the scene. "I jumped down from my boat and stood straight up for 2 or 3 minutes, waiting for somebody to shoot me. Nobody shot. I saw many other soldiers doing the same thing. Only 2 personnel had been wounded by enemy rifle fire during the ship-to-shore movement." Although the LVTs had made it ashore with surprising ease, the same could not be said of the Higgins boats. Contrary to the 27th Division's estimation of the beach conditions, the LCVPs immediately beached on the reef. The seafloor off Red Beach was a maze of boulders and coral heads. Most of the landing craft became stuck on these natural obstacles about 40 meters offshore. Others, luckily, were able to advance about 20 meters closer. Not all of the 460 men and 8 tanks of the second wave were able to be landed, and those that were had to wade through chest-deep water and scramble over submerged boulders. In the estimation of the US official history, it was only the lack of enemy resistance in this area that prevented disaster. But even without Japanese intervention, the operation quickly fell into chaos. Amphibious operations require precise timing. One wave has to leave the beach to make room for the next, and landing craft have to be used for multiple waves. But with many LCVPs stranded on boulders, the whole operation quickly fell behind schedule. On Red Beach 2, only a 15-meter stretch of sand was found to be usable, meaning the Higgins boats had to come in one at a time. By nightfall, the bulk of the infantry, some 2,163 men of the 1st and 3rd Battalion landing teams, had been put ashore, along with a number of tanks, bulldozers and jeeps, although hundreds of tons of supporting supplies and equipment were still afloat. Despite these considerable difficulties, the 1st and 3rd Battalions made rapid progress. Against minimal opposition, the beachhead was rapidly consolidated to a depth of just over 500 metres across a 1500 metre front. On the left flank, the 1st Battalion advanced on Fink Point, effectively clearing this part of the island. On the right, the 3rd Battalion was expecting fierce opposition around the village of Ukangong, but resistance was so light that it was only the terrain, which had been badly cratered by the naval bombardment, that slowed their progress. By 10:30, the whole western end of the island had been secured to a depth of 1300 metres, and the men were advancing on the western tank barrier. Nearly miraculously, despite this severe mistake in predicting the tidal conditions, 2 battalions were now firmly established on Butari Tari, all at very light cost. As Red Beach was being quickly consolidated, the men of the 2nd Battalion landing team were headed for Yellow Beach. Their landing time was set for 10:30. Just as in the earlier landings, the first wave was composed of amphibious tractors. As these approached the shore, they hit the barrier reef about 150 metres from the beach, although this hardly troubled them. As the LBTs drove towards the shoreline, they came under moderate rifle and machine gun fire, but covered by 2 destroyers, they made landfall successfully. The men quickly disembarked and engaged the Japanese force holding King's Wharf, but with most of the beach defences destroyed, this area was rapidly cleared. Behind the LBTs came the landing craft mechanised, essentially an enlarged Higgins boat carrying M4 Sherman medium tanks. As could have been predicted, these ran aground almost 200 metres from the shore, but the shallow lagoon proved to be no obstacle to the tanks, which simply disembarked and drove through the water. 11 of 13 vehicles made it to the beach, with the remaining 2 becoming stuck in submerged shell holes. Behind the tanks came the main body of the 2nd Battalion in LCBPs. Just like the tanks, they were discharged 200 metres from the beach. After some initial hesitation, the men began walking through knee to waist deep water. As they approached the beach, the infantry came under heavy fire from both flanks. Although they could not locate the source of fire precisely, 2 old ruined ships, both of which were no more than mere hulks, were deemed to be the prime suspects. Aircraft and destroyers soaked the old ships with fire, however much of this was ineffective. 5-inch shells were seen to fly over the hull and detonate inland. Casualties during this advance were miraculously small. Despite the complete lack of cover, the inability of the men to run through the water, and the fact that they were clumped together in groups, Japanese fire was almost inexplicably inaccurate, with most of it landing well short. The soaking did its own damage, however, with most of the battalion's radios and specialist equipment such as flamethrowers and bazookas ruined by salt water. Despite all of these difficulties, the operation was proceeding satisfactorily. By midday, the bulk of the battalion had landed and tank infantry teams had driven south, cutting the island in 2. In accordance with the plan, 2 companies executed a left hook and took up blocking positions to the east, while the rest of the battalion advanced on the western tank barrier. This movement was almost brought to a halt by sporadic Japanese rifle fire. Individual Japanese riflemen, often called snipers by the Americans, would climb palm trees and harass the advancing infantry. Not knowing where the fire was coming from, whole platoons would immediately retreat to cover. Moving forward required small, sharp movements from one piece of cover to the next, and by this method the greatly inferior Japanese were able to slow the advance to a snail's pace. By noon, the 2 advancing companies had reached the main Japanese defences at the tank barrier, having moved about 200 metres. The first major resistance was encountered to the immediate rear of the tank barrier. Numerous small air raid shelters and concrete bunkers containing both Korean labourers and Japanese elements. The Koreans, almost as a rule, immediately surrendered, but several positions had to be reduced by force. Tank infantry coordination was critical in engaging these Japanese fortifications, a painful lesson the US Army had learned in 1942. M4 Shermans would advance on the position, suppressing it with fire. This allowed the supporting infantry to move up and finish it off with grenades. By these tactics, the Japanese defences were destroyed, one at a time. A particularly large bunker with a concrete roof was encountered by G Company. Several times infantry had thrown grenades through the opening, only to have them thrown out again. The structure was so well constructed that it survived point-blank 75mm tank fire. Eventually, it had to be demolished by TNT pole charges. It survived this as well, although the blast killed the 12 Japanese men inside. To the west, the 1st Battalion were advancing to make a junction with the 2nd Battalion, which was moving towards them from Yellow Beach. Here they encountered the only really determined resistance on the western half of Butari-Tari. A platoon of Japanese infantry had entrenched an old Lewis gun in a well-sighted position covering the main road. Emplaced in a natural dip in the terrain, the weapon was covered by infantry on both flanks. This proved to be a very stubborn pocket of resistance, and several men were killed by its fire, including Lieutenant Nunnery. This position was simply bypassed by the battalion, leaving a platoon to cover it. By nightfall of the first day, the forces from Red and Yellow Beaches had linked up, and the whole western tank barrier had been cleared. 3 batteries of artillery had been landed, but the proximity of the advancing American forces, closing on each other from 2 different directions as they were, prevented its use. Only minor Japanese resistance had been encountered. Despite the serious American vulnerabilities caused by the tides and the disorganized landings at Yellow Beach, combat losses were only 25 killed and 62 wounded. In fact, said resistance at the western tank barrier was generally sporadic, disorganized, and ineffective. Senior Sergeant Michael Thompson, commanding Company G's 3rd Platoon, recalled an attack on a Japanese machine gun position. "I rushed the pit, jumped in and seized the machine gun to swing it around and face it down the connecting trench. I dropped the machine gun and grabbed my rifle. 3 Japs in the trench, a short distance from me, were beginning to stir. They looked as if they had been stunned by an explosion, so I shot them. I then walked down the trench and came to an object well covered with palm trees. I pulled the leaves back and discovered a much alive Jap soldier, so I shot him also." The state of Japanese morale and coordination is clear from Sergeant Thompson's account. This kind of submission is hardly synonymous with the Japanese fighting spirit displayed at battles such as Bunagona, Saipan, or Iwo Jima. Surely this is, at least partially, explained by the devastating impact of the morning's bombardment. The second day of battle revolved around the reduction of the minor pocket of resistance behind the western tank barrier and an advance towards the eastern defences. Movement around the western tank barrier was continually dogged by friendly fire. Landing craft coming into the beach would open fire on the 2 shipwrecks in the lagoon, erroneously believing them to be occupied. This fire sailed over the wrecks and into the area of the pocket. 1 patrol went to ground under a hail of fire. They encountered so much incoming it could not have possibly come from the single Lewis gun covering the main road. With American forces approaching from 3 directions on such a small island, friendly fire was a constant hazard. Nonetheless, by noon this area was declared cleared. The main effort was an advance towards the eastern tank barrier. Here the 2nd Battalion landing team executed a battalion attack supported by 10 M4 Shermans across a 300-metre front. This time the guardsmen did not allow the sniper fire to slow them down, noting its general ineffectiveness. After all, these were not actually snipers, just Japanese soldiers attempting to harass and slow their advance. The attack was slow but steady. With the infantry moving from cover to cover, it averaged about 3 meters a minute. As the battalion advanced past King's Wharf towards the tank barrier, an area called the Citadel, the fiercest combat of the battle erupted. On the left flank, the wreckage of a Japanese seaplane had been converted into a stout machine gun position, and from this entrenchment, enfilading fire tore into the flank of G Company. The position was no match for the 4 Shermans that drenched the wreck with 75mm and machine gun fire, killing its 18 occupants. Almost simultaneously, the right flank company made contact with an intact area of beach defence, containing 3 75mm dual-purpose guns and a number of fighting positions. In the centre, the left and right flanks were connected by 4 machine gun positions with rifle pits, rather than trenches, connecting them. For 2 hours, the Japanese stood and fought. Nevertheless, one by one, these positions were overrun by a slow, methodical advance. Again, combined arms warfare was critical. Individual rifle platoons would be paired with at least 1 tank, allowing the suppression and elimination of machine guns by armour. The most stout defences were reduced by engineers with TNT satchels, the movement of which was covered by the tanks. The US Army was learning the right technique for dealing with fixed fortifications. A slow, careful and deliberate advance with the close integration of armour, infantry and engineers. On the far left flank, Detachment Z of the 105th Infantry had advanced 700 metres through the most heavily fortified area of the island. The day's fighting only cost them 6 casualties. As the sun rose on the last day of the battle, the majority of the Japanese defences had been broken. Only one major feature remained, the eastern tank barrier. Now it was 3rd Battalion's turn to lead the advance. At 8 AM, its 3 rifle companies began advancing eastward, aided by several platoons of Stuart and Sherman tanks. As they advanced, the artillery landed at Red Beach began shelling the main Japanese positions. Over 900 rounds were expended, in addition to naval gunfire and close air support. The tactics employed around the eastern tank barrier were very similar to those utilised the previous day at the Citadel. Whenever significant enemy fire was encountered, say from a machine gun position, tank infantry teams would immediately engage it, with armour suppressing the position and infantry moving in for the kill with grenades and satchel charges. Although some Japanese were fighting hard, by 9:30 it was clear that the final defensive position was going to be rapidly taken. Several dual-purpose 75mm artillery pieces and machine gun pits were found deserted. Sensing a Japanese collapse, Colonel Hart, the 3rd Battalion CO, ordered an amphibious envelopment. He detached 2 platoons from Alpha Company, reinforced by mortar and machine gun elements, to move through the lagoon by amphibious tractor and land 4 kilometers in the Japanese rear, near the eastern end of Butaritari. They landed unopposed at noon. Informed by several locals that the Japanese were retreating to the nearby island of Kuma, which could be accessed by foot on low tide, another flanking movement was employed. A detachment of the 105th embarked on 9 LVTs, made an unopposed landing on the island, forming a blocking line across its narrow width. With this manoeuvre, the remaining Japanese were now completely cut off. As the remainder of the 3rd Battalion approached the eastern tank barrier, they found it abandoned. With the last defensive position cleared, Hart's men raced to link up with the elements of Alpha Company that had been landed forward, relieving the force by midday. No Japanese were encountered, however, as clearly their main body had withdrawn, escaping the amphibious pincers. By nightfall, the 3 companies of the 3rd Battalion had advanced to the very end of Butaritari, near the reef to Kuma, relieving the forward detachment of Alpha Company. They dug in on a 300-metre front, with both flanks anchored on the ocean. 3 days of fighting on the equator had clearly left the men tired. Many of them left their heavy packs further to the rear, which included their entrenching tools. This meant the foxholes and fighting positions were shallower than usual. In fact, some men did not bother to dig one, preferring to simply sit behind coconut logs. There was also a lapse in reconnaissance. Despite the fact that 3 hours of light remained after the order to dig in was given, not a single patrol was sent beyond the perimeter. Clearly, neither the men nor their officers considered the remaining Japanese a threat. First Lieutenant Robert Wilson later remembered, "Many of us had the idea that there were no Japs left. When the firing began, I didn't believe it was the real thing." The first engagement began at about 10 PM. A group of locals moving through the perimeter were followed by an element of Japanese infantry. As they approached, one of the men made the sounds of a crying baby, hoping this would fool the defenders. They came to within 20 metres of the forward positions before they were recognised. Seeing through the ruse, a gunner tore into the group with his 1919, killing 10. Immediately after this action, the Japanese began probing the perimeter. Rather than a massed banzai charge, the Japanese relied on small unit infiltrations, with sections and platoons making minor attacks all across the line. Despite the weakness of most of the riflemen's fighting positions, the line was anchored by its heavy weapons. The machine guns had been placed well, especially on the far left and right of the line. As the devastating fire of these weapons broke up the first assault, they soon became the primary focus of the later attacks. Although most of the battalion was under rifle, machine gun and mortar fire for at least some period during the night, the combat revolved around these 3 or 4 weapon positions. As the Japanese concentrated their focus on these machine gun positions, bodies simply began to pile up in front of them. As dawn broke, 51 enemy dead were found just in front of the gun line, with several more who had crawled away from the line to die. A few defenders had escaped to Kuma, but these blundered into the defensive line established the day before. All were killed or wounded. Makin had fallen, and in the end it had been taken at remarkably small cost. Total battle casualties were 218, with 66 killed. Japanese losses were estimated to be 550, including 105 prisoners, although after a few more weeks of mopping up operations, the whole Japanese garrison would be accounted for. Although total losses had been relatively light, the exchange ratio had not been generally favourable to the Americans. About 3 Japanese casualties were inflicted for every 2 Americans killed or wounded. Considering the massive superiority in both US ground forces and supporting fire, this is not a favourable exchange ratio. This point is only emphasised once naval casualties are considered. Mississippi suffered a major explosion in a gun turret, killing 43 men. Worse was the loss of the escort carrier Liscombe Bay, which went down with 53 officers and 591 men after she was torpedoed by an unidentified submarine. General Holland Smith, the 5th Amphibious Corps commander, was later of the opinion that the capture of Makin was infuriatingly slow, a position the US official history is in agreement with. Indeed, said history is, generally speaking, rather critical of the performance of the 27th Division at Makin, particularly the plan. The Makin operation may have been unnecessarily slow and needlessly complex, but it did work. Despite the potentiality for a large-scale friendly fire incident around the Western Tank Barrier, especially when most of 2nd Battalion's radios were destroyed by the need to wade through 200 meters of ocean, no such catastrophe occurred. The major Japanese defensive position was successfully outflanked, and the landing of the 2nd Battalion at Yellow Beach made that position essentially untenable. Nevertheless, the truth is the Americans generally, and General Ralph Smith specifically, got lucky on Makin. Had the Japanese defences been more resolutely held, or had there been a more credible force on the island, the problems with beach selection and the inability of the landing craft to cross the outer reef would have led to a bloodbath. Unfortunately for the US Marines of the 2nd Division, their luck would not be so good. On the morning of the 20th of November, as the guardsmen of the 27th Division were boarding their landing craft at Makin, 200 kilometers to their south, the Marines of the 2nd Division were approaching Tarawa. Facing them was a much more daunting task. The island of Betio was a much more important Japanese possession, and thus much more effort had been expended in its defense. The local Japanese commander, Admiral Shibasaki, had nearly 5,000 men under his command. His order of battle included the main body of the 3rd Special Base Force, numbering 1,122 men, the 7th Special Naval Landing Force, with a strength of 1,497, and 2 construction units, the 4th Fleet Construction Department Detachment and the main body of the 111th Construction Unit, with a combined strength of 2,217 men, providing Shibasaki with a grand total of 4,836. The base and Special Naval Landing Force units comprised the core of Japanese fighting strength, as although many of the 2,000 labourers had been armed, their value as combat troops was low. About 1,000 of these construction troops were Korean. Perhaps there were about 3,000 troops on Betio that were realistically capable of combat, half of which were elite Japanese Marines. This infantry force was supported by 7 Type 95 Har-Go light tanks. Thus, not only was the garrison 6 times the size of that on Makin, it included some highly motivated and very skilled infantry formations. In addition to the larger size of the garrison on Betio, much more effort had been expended on its fortification. Unlike Butaritari, where large sections of the island were simply left undefended, fixed defences dominated every avenue of approach to Betio. It was, certainly, an island fortress. The majority of this tiny island was taken up by the Japanese airbase, which ran for 1.5 kilometers along its spine. Every inch of shoreline was covered by pre-sighted machine guns arranged in a crossfire. Along the northern coast, facing the lagoon, dual-purpose Type 93 13mm heavy machine guns, the Japanese equivalent of the 50 caliber M2, dotted the shoreline. These positions, which were open to allow the weapons to be used in an anti-aircraft role, were in place to allow fire directly out to sea or to enfilade any enemy that reached the beach. A low artificial barrier was constructed along the beach, a place where attacking infantry would surely take cover. Machine guns were placed at the end of these embankments, giving them cleared lanes of fire right down their length. The south coast, facing the ocean, was covered by a similar complex of machine guns, although these were more often the ubiquitous Type 92 7.7 medium machine gun. Although the coastal defences were well organised and formidable, In the interior of the island, the Japanese positions were more haphazard. The main features were concrete air raid shelters which also acted as storehouses. These were very strong features indeed, and acted as makeshift fighting positions for the garrison. However, they were not designed for this purpose, and thus typically had several blind avenues of approach. In some cases, fire from the doorways of these bunkers was mutually supporting, but this was only by accident. Between the major defensive features, the Japanese had constructed numerous tank ditches, barbed wire obstacles, and coconut log fences. On the beach, the passive defense system was even more formidable. Concrete tetrahedrons had been scattered along the reef, which were submerged at high water. Any landing craft that encountered one of these obstacles was guaranteed to become stuck. Double apron high wire fences were placed in the water, and a double apron low wire fence extended along the beach itself. The larger obstacles were arranged in a way to funnel any landing craft into a pre-designated kill zone, which could be swept by both heavy machine gun and anti-boat fires from 8cm, 7cm, 37mm and 13mm dual-purpose guns. On the beach, the barbed wire fences were arranged diagonally, and in every place the fence terminated in a machine gun position, allowing for flanking fire all along its length. On both ends of the island, and placed at strategic points along the north and south shoreline, were heavy shore batteries, the largest of which were 4 8-inch guns that were emplaced on the eastern and western tips of Betio facing out to sea. These naval guns would pose a substantial threat to any warship smaller than a heavy cruiser which approached close, especially destroyers covering any landing. Serving the same purpose were 4 5.5-inch guns, which dominated the east and west channels. Indirect artillery support was also available to the Japanese in the form of a battery of 70mm howitzers and 2 batteries of mountain guns. All told, on Betio, there was a total of 4 8-inch guns, 4 5.5-inch guns, 4 12.7cm and 6 8cm dual-purpose anti-aircraft guns, 10 75mm mountain guns, 6 70mm howitzers, 8 7cm dual-purpose single mounts, 9 37mm field guns, 27 13mm single mounts, 4 13mm double mounts, and 7 tanks mounting 37mm guns. The shore and anti-aircraft batteries were coordinated by a centralized fire control complex, complete with rangefinders, directors, and searchlights. By and large, all of the heavy weapons were emplaced in well-sited and constructed positions made of coconut logs. Ammunition and personnel were protected in concrete underground shelters that were covered by sand, typically with one such position serving a pair of weapons. These proved to be highly resistant to the preliminary bombardment. Tarawa was, truly, a fortress. It was the most heavily defended atoll that the Allies would invade all throughout the Pacific War. In fact, the beach defences here were in greater concentration and were better constructed than even those faced by the 1st Division at the much more famous Omaha Beach in 1944. In the words of the US official history, with the possible exception of Iwo Jima, its beaches were better protected against a landing force than any encountered in any theatre of war throughout World War II. Betio also had several natural advantages in comparison to Makin. The barrier reef was, in places, well over 500 meters in depth, rather than 40. To add to the immense challenge the Marines would face was their comparative lack of resources. At Tarawa, 2 attacking regiments would be concentrated against 1, a force that enjoyed all the advantages of amphibious defense. Far from the much more favourable force ratio enjoyed on Makin, which, if combat troops are considered exclusively, was as high as 10-1. As the southern attack force approached Tarawa Atoll on the 19th of November, it was spotted by a Japanese aircraft. The intruder was rapidly shot down by the covering combat air patrol, but not before it transmitted its contact report. Warned of the approaching US Armada, the defenders were ready. The main transport group steamed towards a position just to the west of the atoll, opposite the entrance to its lagoon. The current was stronger than had been predicted, and as the amphibious transports were lowering their attack craft, they came within range of the Japanese shore batteries. In the darkness, shells began landing amongst the packed transport ships. Given how many men were aboard, even just one hit would have caused heavy casualties. The covering force responded immediately. Colorado and Maryland opened fire at 0500. A 5.5-inch or 8-inch shore battery was no match for a pair of 16-inch gunned battleships, and within 40 minutes one of the guns had been neutralized, its magazine seemed to explode. The preliminary bombardment of Betio was more problematic than at Makin. The fire support group was certainly impressive. The battleship Tennessee with her 14-inch guns, Colorado and Maryland with 16-inch main batteries, 2 heavy and 2 light cruisers, and a number of supporting destroyers. Nevertheless, the task of the fire support forces was complicated by the requirement that naval gunfire cease as the carrier aircraft made their attack runs. Thus, certain periods were reserved for certain kinds of bombardment, say half an hour for naval gunfire and then 20 minutes for an airstrike. This worked perfectly on Makin, but at Tarawa the aircraft were late on their first run. For half an hour no fire was directed on the island, allowing the defenders to man their guns unmolested. After watching his minor vessels narrowly escape hit after hit, at 6:05 Admiral Hill ordered his vessels to open fire. The aircraft finally arrived at 6:13, bombing and strafing the defences. Right at this time, a couple of minesweepers and destroyers had entered the lagoon to clear lanes for the landing craft. These minor vessels were peppered with fire. The destroyer Ringgold suffered a direct hit. A 5-inch shell detonated in her engine room, killing almost all steam and electrical power. She luckily escaped annihilation when another shell glanced off her forward torpedo tube. This confusion had led to a substantial delay in the landing, with H-hour now pushed back to 9 AM. Betio was subjected to a fearsome bombardment for nearly 4 hours before the first Marines made landfall. 3,000 tons of naval shells had been expended alone. Admiral Kingman later recalled his impression of the bombardment. It seemed almost impossible for any human being to be alive on Betio. This was a serious overestimation of its effectiveness. The picturesque Pacific island was now little more than a cratered wasteland, but by and large the strongly built Japanese fortifications had simply shrugged off the beating. Yes, any personnel above ground in rifle pits or trenches were surely killed, but most were sheltering in underground concrete dugouts. By best estimation, 1 8-inch naval gun battery and 2 12cm anti-aircraft batteries had been silenced by direct hits. But other than that, the majority of the defenders and their heavy weapons remained intact. The greatest impact of the bombardment was the destruction of Admiral Shibasaki's communications. The Japanese relied on above-ground telephone wires to coordinate their forces, all of which had been obliterated. In a final failure, Admiral Hill ordered that the bombardment cease by 8:55. Assuming that the first waves would be approaching the landing beaches for the 9 o'clock H-hour. When he was informed that the landing forces had been delayed, and that it was unlikely that anyone would land by 9:15, he maintained his order, reasoning that firing through the thick cloud of smoke that now blanketed the island would pose too much of a threat to the landing forces. The final phase of the landing was supposed to be covered by air attacks on the beach defences, but as the airmen had not been notified of the delay, this occurred half an hour early. Thus, the Japanese defenders were given 20 minutes to rush out from their bunkers and man their weapons without any suppressing fire directed at them, with the sole exception of a couple of destroyers on Red Beach 3. The initial landing zone on Betio stretched for 2,500 meters along its northern shore. Approaching from the lagoon, 3 battalion landing teams would assault the beach in line abreast, with each battalion immediately keeping contact with the other. This arrangement, landing along a regimental front, allowed for a powerful concentration of firepower and minimized the possibility that any of the assaulting battalions would be isolated and defeated in detail. On the American right, assaulting Red Beach 1, was Major John F. Skotels, 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marine Regiment. Unlike the other landing zones, Red Beach 1 was an irregular piece of coastline, essentially a cove where the shore on the flanks extended farther out to sea. This geography meant the attacking waves would be raked by flanking fire as they approached the beach. All along the shoreline, the Japanese had built a 1-meter high coconut log obstacle, which was, at places, about 20 meters from the high water line. At others was the shoreline itself. Although this provided some cover, it was flanked by machine gun positions, and any movement inland would mean slowly clambering up the fence into a cleared kill zone. The battalion's plan for the operation involved landing 2 companies in the first 3 waves. Company K would land on the left of the beach, Company I on the right. Both were reinforced by elements of the Heavy Weapons Company. These forces would be put ashore in 3 waves of amphibious tractors. The 3rd Rifle Company of the Battalion, Company L, and the Mortar Platoon of Company M would land in the 4th and 5th waves. A platoon of tanks would accompany the last waves. As the first waves of LVTs approached Red Beach 1, the shoreline came alive with automatic fire. Here the outer reef was 1,500 meters from the beach. This was no immediate obstacle to the tractors, which simply pulled themselves over the rocks. However, as they lumbered along, they were raked with defensive fire. The LVT was not heavily armoured, and as the waves of attacking landing craft slowly approached the shore, they were easy targets for the Japanese gunners. On the left flank of Red Beach 1, at the junction with Red Beach 2, a powerful strongpoint had escaped the bombardment largely intact. As the cove projected further inland of this position, the landing waves provided perfect flanking targets for the numerous heavy weapons in place there. Heavy machine gun and cannon fire tore into the tractors as they moved past this feature. As the vehicles were not sufficiently protected to stop a 13mm projectile, the Marines inside suffered terribly, packed as they were like sardines. One by one, the LVTs were left riddled and smoking wrecks, with any Marines that were lucky enough to survive clambering over the side. By the time Company K actually made it to the beach, the fire of this strongpoint alone had rendered it combat ineffective. Half of its strength was either dead or wounded. On the right, I Company fared a little better in the ship-to-shore movement, but they were pinned and enfiladed by machine gun fire on the water's edge, and within 2 hours, they too had lost half of their number. All along Red Beach 1, the remnants of the first 3 waves sat pinned behind the coconut log wall, itself raked by Japanese fire. Without armour, they stood little chance of making it off the beach alive. The tanks the men on the beach so badly needed were approaching in a number of landing craft mechanized, along with the 3rd Rifle Company, which was loaded into Higgins boats. Much to the coxswain's surprise, as they approached the outer reef, they found it nearly dry. Just 2 feet of water covered the rocks. As some of the boats began to turn around and look for another way through, they were all ordered to stop and disembark. As the ramps went down, the men plunged into the water and began to wade ashore. They were 1,200 meters from the beach. One can only imagine the horror of being ordered to disembark your landing craft almost a mile from a shoreline that was alive with automatic weapon fire. The prospect of slowly wading through an ocean that was boiling with bullet impacts without any hope of cover or fire support. As the Marines of K Company bravely waded towards their comrades on the beach, they began to suffer heavily at the hands of the Japanese heavy machine guns. Luck alone, seemingly, decided who lived and who died. The barrier reef around Betio is not flat. In some areas the men waded through waist-deep water, then only to come upon 20-meter wide holes that were several meters deep. At these holes, groups of individuals began to bunch together, making them easy targets. Some men drowned as they tried to swim across, heavily loaded as they were. As the tanks advanced towards the beach, they too were halted by patches of deep water. The tank reconnaissance men entered the deep water with flags, trying to find a way forward. These immediately drew intense Japanese fire, and nearly all were killed. Their sacrifice was not in vain, however, as several tanks made it to the beach. The vehicles made landfall on the left flank of Red Beach 1, where the Japanese fire was most intense. As they approached the beach, they found it literally carpeted with dead and wounded Marines. The tank platoon commander decided that he could not order his vehicles to advance over so many of his fallen comrades, and ordered his tanks back into the water. As they drove along the beach looking for another exit, 4 became stuck in another pothole, and one by one these were knocked out by 40mm flanking fire. Only 2 of the original 13 successfully made it ashore. Sitting out on the reef in waist-deep water, Major Scotel took stock of the tactical situation confronting him and his battalion. Clearly, the attack on Red Beach 1 was nearly becoming catastrophic. The 2 lead companies were pinned on the beach. They had both suffered 50% casualties. Almost all of the tanks were either bogged or destroyed. The reserve company was wading through the water towards the beach. As they were more widely dispersed than the men that came in on LVTs, their losses were less severe. But by the time they made landfall, 1/3 of the men had been killed or wounded. After making contact with Colonel Shoup, commander of the 2nd Marine Regimental Combat Team, Scotel provided the following situation report. receiving heavy fire all along beach, unable to land all, issue in doubt. All further landing waves were halted until further notice, and Skotal was ordered to come ashore on Red Beach 2 and try and work across to his battalion from there. He would not make landfall until the late afternoon. To the east of Red Beach 1 was Red Beach 2, the objective of Lieutenant Colonel Herbert R. Amy's 2nd Battalion, 2nd Marine Regiment. Red Beach 2 stretched along a relatively straight piece of coastline, terminating on the right at the end of the cove which was Red Beach 1, and on the left at the central pier that extended 500 metres out to sea. The plan for the assault was very similar to Red Beach 1. 2 reinforced rifle companies would land in 3 waves of amphibious tractors, followed by the 3rd Rifle Company, headquarters, and the balance of the Heavy Weapons Company. These would land in the 4th and 5th waves in Higgins boats. Much like the experience of their comrades to the east, the first waves met with disaster. As the LVTs clambered up the outer reef and began driving towards the shore, they were met with a torrent of fire from all along their front. As the lumbering beasts were only in waist-deep water, they were easy targets for the Japanese gunners, silhouetted as they were against the still lagoon water. The heaviest fire was coming from the same strong point that had caused the 3rd Battalion so much trouble. The impact of this devastating weight of fire was immediate confusion. As knocked out vehicles piled up, their occupants simply climbed out and started wading to shore. Of the survivors, many began driving erratically trying to evade the fire. One group, driving to the right, eventually landed on Red Beach 1 in an isolated position. This confusion led to rapid disorganization as the different companies became intermixed. But, in any case, very few of the tractors reached the shoreline. On the left, the men were able to find some cover from the murderous fire by hiding under the pier. However, this only spared them from annihilation. When this unit had finally reached the shoreline, it had been decimated and could do little more than advance to the coconut log seawall about 20 metres from the water. As Lieutenant Colonel Amy arrived with his 3rd Company, he found the reef was essentially dry. The colonel immediately ordered his men to disembark and begin the 1,000-metre march to the shore. Keen to get forward, Amy commandeered an LVT that was heading back to sea. As it approached the beach, the tractor was raked by 13mm fire. With the vehicle out of commission, the colonel jumped over the side and began advancing through the fire until he was cut down by a machine gun burst. Platoon-sized elements of the 2nd Battalion had made it ashore all along the line of the beach. However, most of these were too far separated to make physical contact. Their radios had generally been destroyed by Japanese fire and a saltwater drenching, and their commanding officer had been killed. At some places, especially on the left flank, some brave Marines had crawled over the seawall and were digging in behind it, but at no place was the beachhead more than 50 metres deep. Most of the men were pinned on the sand behind the seawall, where pre-sighted pillboxes mercilessly poured fire into them. Rather than advancing inland, the battalion's attention was wholly focused on survival. If anyone was going to make it off that beach alive, the pillboxes that jutted out from the seawall and dominated the thin strip of sand had to be eliminated. Groups of sappers from the 18th Marines bravely reduced these murderous positions one at a time, approaching to just meters and destroying them with satchel charges. Moving up and down the line, they eventually cleared the whole beach of this flanking fire. Unlike Red Beach 1, a reasonably steady flow of reinforcements were landed in more LVTs, and a line of men waded under the cover of the pier. Nevertheless, all movement on the beach and its approaches were subjected to constant heavy caliber fire from the right flank strongpoint. The final landing area was Red Beach 3. This area was allocated to Major Henry P. Crow's 2nd Marine Battalion, 8th Marine Regiment. Red Beach 3 stretched for about 800 metres to the left of the termination of Red Beach 2 at the central pier. The experience of Crow's men could not be more different when compared to the other assaulting battalions. They may as well have been in a different battle. The plan for the landing here was identical to the other 2 beaches, a pair of companies in amphibian tractors, followed by the 3rd Company team in Higgins boats. The tractors made contact with the reef some 3,000 metres from the beach. However, despite constant 70mm artillery fire, nearly all made it to the shore intact. Of the 522 men in the first 2 waves, just 25 were casualties in the ship-to-shore movement. Most of the men were able to disembark with dry feet. Two of the tractors found a hole in the coconut log seawall and drove inland, advancing across the runway before disembarking their forces. 5 of the 6 officers in E Company were wounded or killed as they hit the beach, but this did not stop the company from clearing the shoreline. There are 2 main reasons why the landings were so much more successful at Red Beach 3. The first is the absence of the murderous Japanese strongpoint at the junction between Red Beaches 1 and 2. This one position was able to pour flanking fire into both battalions, and the number of heavy weapons here made the LVTs particularly vulnerable. The heavy caliber fire from this position was so devastating that it was safer to walk into Red Beach 1 across a mile of water with no cover than to be in an amphibious tractor. But the second, and perhaps most important, reason why things were so different on this beach was the nature of the fire support. Unlike the other 2 beaches, there were 2 destroyers just offshore, the battered Ringgold and Danshell, both of which kept up a torrent of fire as the assaulting waves made their approach, lifting the bombardment just 7 minutes before the Marines made landfall. It wasn't the destructive impact of this fire that was critical, but rather its suppressive effect. The Japanese were left pinned inside their shelters by the constant stream of 5-inch and 40mm fire, and by the time they manned their defences, the first waves were already on top of them. This episode underlines just how crucial Admiral Hill's order to cease fire nearly half an hour before the landings was. One can understand his desire to prevent his big gun battleships from hitting friendly forces, but the alternative left the Marines stranded and facing a nightmare of reef and heavy caliber fire. By 10:30, the Regimental Combat Team Commander, Colonel Shoup, was sitting on the barrier reef beyond Red Beach 2. His LVT had tried to make it to shore 3 times but had been turned back by heavy fire. Eventually the colonel decided to wade in, using the pier as cover, and a regimental command post was finally established on Red Beach 2. His situation was somewhat precarious. On the left, he had secured a reasonably solid beachhead. His centre battalion had been badly mauled, but he was able to land additional forces here by using the pier. He had basically no information about what was happening on Red Beach 1, primarily because Major Skotal had not yet made it ashore. Nonetheless, he was becoming increasingly concerned about his right flank battalion. It was scattered all along the beach, with a major concentration on the far right of the line. Many of the LVTs had been driven to the right by the fire of the central strongpoint. The fire from this position had driven some elements of 2nd Battalion to land at the far end of Red Beach 1, 3rd Battalion's front. This included 2nd Battalion's XO, Major Rice, who did have a radio with him. Rice's report stung Shoup into action. Clearly, 3rd Battalion badly needed immediate help. Thus, he decided to commit his regimental reserve, Major Wood B. Kyle's 1st Battalion, 2nd Marine Regiment. Kyle was ordered to land his battalion on Red Beach 2 and drive to the relief of the 3rd Battalion that was pinned on Red Beach 1. Kyle immediately deployed his forces but, just like everyone else, found that his Higgins boats could not pass the reef. By necessity, an informal relay was organised. Higgins boats would ferry men to the edge of the reef, where LVTs would take them to shore. The major problem with this arrangement was the loss of amphibian tractors. They were becoming more scarce as their value steadily increased. Kyle marched up and down the reef, commandeering any LVTs he could find, and by 11 o'clock he had enough to move 2 companies to the beach. As they advanced towards the beach, they were riddled with fire from the central strongpoint. Just as the men of the 2nd Battalion had found, with so much heavy caliber fire sweeping the approaches to the beach, the LVTs were often more dangerous than wading. As more and more vehicles were hit, so were the men inside them. The survivors were forced to wade into shore in the teeth of the very same fire. Of the 2 assaulting companies, a total of 1 officer and 110 men actually made it ashore. On board USS Maryland, the divisional commander, General Julian Smith, ordered the commitment of a single battalion of the Divisional Reserve, the 3rd Battalion, 8th Marines. The 3rd Battalion loaded themselves onto Higgins boats and began moving towards Betio. As Red Beach 3 was the most secure, it was decided to land them there. Yet again, they were forced to disembark their men at the edge of the reef. As they waded the 3,000 meters to shore, they began to suffer heavily from rifle and medium machine gun fire. Several men also drowned in patches of deep water. By the afternoon, 5 battalions had been committed to battle on Tarawa. Of those, 4 had been badly mauled. Only on one beach was the beachhead secure in any depth. Along most of Red Beach 2, the Marines had barely advanced past the waterline, and the situation on Red Beach 1 was still unclear. Communications between the battalions and between the forces ashore and the fleet were intermittent and unreliable. Most of the radios had been destroyed by enemy fire or salt water. General Smith was only able to receive handwritten situation reports, which were delivered to the end of the central pier and ferried out to USS Maryland by small boat, a task only made possible by the clearance of the pier by the scout sniper platoon. Clearly, the battle for Tarawa was still hanging in the balance. To take the island, General Smith needed to bring his weight to bear, but the reef was proving to be an existential threat. Even if he deployed the whole division, if every battalion had to wade through 1,000 meters of waist-deep water under enemy fire, then by the time they actually reached Betio, none of them would be really combat effective. Unless the situation changed appreciably, defeat was certainly a possibility. Although regimental or divisional command did not know it, the situation on Red Beach 1 was better than expected. The strong point between the two beaches still dominated the left flank positions, and there were still elements pinned along the shoreline there. But the remainder of the 3rd Battalion, including elements of the 2nd Battalion that had been driven nearly 2 kilometers off course, were now holding a reasonably solid beachhead on the very northwestern tip of the island. This polyglot battalion was now under the command of Major Ryan, L Company commanding officer. Ryan was a highly aggressive and capable young officer, and he was busily organising an attack. In the early afternoon, 2 medium tanks had reached his position, and with their aid, he began advancing south. With no other fire support, Ryan's men began attacking, anchored on their right flank by the ocean. The fact that Ryan and his Marines were in any state to make an unsupported attack after the nightmare they had experienced that morning is crystalline evidence of the bravery and high fighting spirit shown by the United States Marine Corps at Tarawa. Moving from one bunker to the next, the Marines made steady progress, using the same tank infantry tactics that had been so effective on Makin. Halfway through the engagement, one of his M4s had been knocked out by an anti-tank gun, and the other was damaged in a duel with a Type 95 light tank. Ryan and his men had advanced to within 300 meters of the southern shoreline, and in doing so had cleared all of the fixed defenses along Green Beach, which faces west. Ryan repeatedly tried to inform regiment and divisional command that Green Beach was open to land reinforcements, but communications again failed him. At 1600, with his armour knocked out and many of his men killed or wounded, Ryan decided to retreat back to his attack start line, the compact defensive perimeter in the northwest corner of the island. Finally, at 1800, Colonel Shoup succeeded in establishing radio contact with Ryan. By nightfall on the 20th of November, the American position was precarious. 5 battalions had been landed, but those probably had a combined combat strength of 3. On the far right flank, Ryan's men were in a good defensive position, but to their left, small pockets remained pinned along the shoreline by torrential enemy fire. The strong point between Red Beaches 1 and 2 not only separated the battalions, it continued to cover the approaches to both beaches with heavy caliber fire, making effective supply and reinforcement very difficult. On the left, at Red Beach 3, the initial landings by the 2nd Battalion 8th Marines had proven to be remarkably successful, and the beachhead was secured in some depth. Nevertheless, on the left flank of the beachhead at the Burns Phillip Wharf, another strong point dominated the approaches. All along the line, the Marines prepared for the inevitable Japanese counterattack. At places, there was literally nowhere to retreat to. But for hours, no attack came. This precious time gave Colonel Shoup the breathing space to land badly needed supplies. When the counterattacks did materialize, they were in small units probing the lines, rather than well-coordinated assaults. This Japanese inactivity was seemingly miraculous, but in reality it was probably explained by the destruction of Shibasaki's communications. The Admiral probably had a very confused understanding of the situation and disposition of his own forces. With no orders to attack, many Japanese elements probably just held their positions. As dawn rose on the 21st, the vicious fight for Betio resumed in earnest. The first action of the day was the landing of another battalion from the Divisional Reserve, the 1st Battalion 8th Marines. The original intention was to land this force on the eastern end of the island, but Colonel Shoup requested that they be landed at Red Beach 2. Just like all the others, this battalion disembarked at the end of the pier and waded ashore under constant fire from the right and left flank strongpoints. And, just like all the others, their strength was badly expended before they even reached the shore. Their objective was the murderous Japanese position between Red Beaches 1 and 2. Supported by 75mm pack howitzers used in the direct fire role, the Marines attacked these formidable defences with little success. This was a tactical mistake. Shoup was clearly beating his head against a wall trying to take this position, and the strength of another battalion was wasted pointlessly. Nevertheless, real progress was being made on the flanks. On Red Beach 3, the left flank strongpoint at Burns Phillip Wharf was proving to be just as stubborn, but between these two positions the Japanese defences were much less formidable. Some elements had broken through to the airfield on D-Day, but only in platoon strength. These positions were finally relieved by the main strength of the 2nd Battalion 2nd Marines on D+1, giving the beachhead considerable depth in this sector, almost 500 metres. The last remaining Japanese pillboxes that dominated the beach itself were finally destroyed, allowing the men to move around this section of sand safely. Although strong Japanese positions remained on the flanks, Red Beaches 2 and 3 were now firmly linked. Lieutenant Colonel Walter I. Jordan, commanding officer of the 2nd Battalion 2nd Marines, decided to advance with all of the forces available, with the objective of reaching the south shore, only about 300 metres from his position. There were 3 companies with him at the airfield, with a combined strength of just 160 men. Despite their weakness, the men set off, and after clearing several Japanese machine gun positions, were digging in on the southern shore. They were almost out of food, water and ammunition, but they had cut the island in half. The decisive action of the battle took place on the right flank. The most critical factor in American success at Tarawa was the establishment of a safe and secure landing area where reinforcements could be effectively deployed. Shoup's plan of having men wade ashore under heavy machine gun fire at Red Beach 2 was simply not a path to victory, and without a safe landing area, General Smith could not land sufficient forces to reduce the strongpoint between Red Beaches 1 and 2, the very thing that was making landing reinforcements so difficult. On the morning of the 21st, Major Ryan and his exhausted men left the safety of their entrenchments once again. This time, he had a naval liaison officer with him, 2nd Lieutenant Thomas N. Green, who miraculously had a working radio. Ryan advanced from the right flank of the Green Beach defences with the objective of rolling them up one by one. He recaptured many of the positions he had cleared the day before with little resistance. However, at 11 o'clock, on the far southern end of Green Beach, he came upon a Japanese defensive complex of bunkers, emplaced 5-inch guns and medium machine guns. Its rear was protected by a tank ditch, fighting positions and wire obstacles. Although the 5-inch guns had been knocked out by the preliminary bombardment, such a position would still have made Green Beach just as dangerous as Red Beach 1. Ryan's forces were certainly not strong enough to attack a position like that, but this time he actually had fire support. Under the direction of Lieutenant Green, 2 destroyers moved into under a nautical miles range, essentially point blank, and poured fire into the position. After a half an hour's drenching of 5-inch high explosive and 40mm shells, Green called off the onslaught and Ryan's men advanced. They met little resistance. By midday, all of Green Beach was secure and Ryan was holding a defensive line 200 metres inland. About mid-afternoon on D-Day, when it was clear that the landings on Makin were going better than expected and the American position on Tarawa was critical, Admiral Hill requested the deployment of the Divisional Reserve, the 2nd Marine Division's 3rd Regiment. 2 hours later, the 6th Marine Regimental Combat Team was on its way to Tarawa. It wasn't until the next day that the regiment was ready for deployment. General Smith decided to land a fresh battalion over the newly captured Green Beach, a 2nd Battalion on neighbouring Gilbert Islands to cut off any Japanese retreat across the reef and hold the 3rd Battalion in reserve. The 1st Battalion's 6th Marines began landing on Green Beach at 1640, having used rubber boats to negotiate the reef. Only casualties that were sustained occurred when an LVT loaded with supplies hit a mine. The supporting light tank troop had trouble crossing the reef and only came ashore at 1800, making the intended afternoon attack impossible. This delay proved fortunate, as throughout the second night, a more coordinated attack plan for the 22nd of November was formulated. This would be more ably supported by air and naval fire support, and artillery landed on Gilbert Island. At 0800, the 1st Battalion 6th Marines left its start position. Its objective was to advance east from the beachhead at Green Beach with their right flank anchored on the ocean. Led by Major William K. Jones, the battalion attacked across a 2-company front with 1 in reserve. Advancing behind 3 tanks, Jones's men made steady progress. Several concrete fighting positions were taken with relative ease, and within a few hours, Jones had cleared the southern edge of the island, linking up with the 1st Battalion 2nd Marines who had reached the coast the day before. Jones estimated he had killed around 250 enemy during the attack in exchange for light casualties. It is clear that the Japanese forces manning the southern defences during this period were not Special Naval Landing Force Marines, units that were probably concentrated in the strong points between the landing beaches. The ease of Jones's advance is evidence of how much training, morale, and fighting spirit matter in battle. At 11 o'clock, Jones was ordered to move through the friendly positions he had just reached and continue attacking east with the objective of clearing the airfield. He would be supported on his left flank by the 2nd Battalion 8th Marines, which would attack along the northern shore of the island. Behind him, the 3rd Battalion 6th Marines landed over Green Beach, suffering no casualties in doing so, which would act as a reserve in this area. The battalion advanced over a single company front, with the 3 companies arranged in column. As soon as Jones's men left friendly positions, they ran into fierce resistance, with determined Japanese infantry holding heavy weapons emplacements along the line of the airstrip. One especially stubborn position was an entrenched twin 37mm gun. For 90 minutes, 7 Stuart light tanks poured fire onto the position to no avail. It was only silenced when an M4 Sherman was brought up to the line. In all, by 6:30 p.m, Jones's battalion had gained another 800 metres. To the north, the 2nd Battalion had faced equally fierce resistance, and Jones was ordered to move one of his companies to the left and relieve them. To Jones's left, the 2nd Battalion 8th Marines had endured some ferocious fighting. A number of steel and concrete pillboxes had been pouring fire into the left flank of Red Beach 3 since D-Day. There were 3 positions, 2 bunkers, one made of coconut logs and the other of steel plate, and a large concrete bomb-proof shelter, each arranged to provide mutual support. One could not be approached without coming into another's field of fire. In a strike of luck, the battalion's mortar platoon scored a direct hit on the log bunker. This detonated the ammunition stored in it, killing the occupants. With this position destroyed, an M4 medium tank was able to approach the steel pillbox, scoring several direct hits with 75mm fire. All that remained was the large concrete shelter. These large concrete buildings had several small entrances with a limited view. They were not actually designed to act as fighting positions. By suppressing these openings with rifle fire, several sappers were able to approach the building, and after an hour's firefight, they were able to establish men on its roof. Seeing Marines on top of the building, the Japanese made a fierce counterattack. At this moment of crisis, 1st Lieutenant Alexander Bonnyman met this charge alone, breaking it up with his flamethrower. Several Japanese men met a terrible fate at Bonnyman's hands before he was cut down himself. His actions alone saved a dire situation. For his bravery and his sacrifice, Lieutenant Bonnyman received the Medal of Honor. The other major assault on the 22nd was the reduction of the Japanese strongpoint that separated Red Beaches 1 and 2. More than any other component of Japanese action or defense during the battle, this position had extracted an exorbitant toll in blood. Indeed, it would not fall easily. As the infantry approached, it found that this area was strongly fortified with concrete pillboxes, gun emplacements, and fighting positions. Indirect fire support and the preliminary bombardment had made no impression whatsoever. 3 companies attacked the position in line abreast. The 2 most inland formations made some minor gains, but along the coast the advance was stopped cold. The use of tank infantry tactics was less effective here. The fighting positions were not only mutually supporting, but with so many large caliber heavy weapons, several vehicles were knocked out by covering fire. It often took the nearly suicidal bravery of engineers to make any progress, rushing the bunkers and destroying them with demolitions. As night fell on the 3rd day of the battle, it seemed as though much heavy fighting remained before the island would be secured. General Smith landed to take personal command of the battle, and was busy making preparations for the 4th day of operations. His staff were estimating that another 5 days of heavy fighting would be required, and with that in mind, he ordered that his last battalion be redeployed from Bariki Island. However, events across the line of battle would make those preparations unnecessary. All throughout the battle, the Japanese had been unable to effectively organize a counterattack. With telephone communications between their various units and positions destroyed by the naval bombardment, the coordination required to attack American forces was simply absent. But now, with the exception of the strong point between Red Beaches 1 and 2, all of the remaining Japanese forces, around 1,000 men, were concentrated in the eastern tip of the island. This proximity allowed for communication and coordination, and for the first time in the battle, one that was already lost, the Japanese were preparing their trademark night counterattack. Facing them were Major Jones's 1st Battalion 6 Marines. The battalion's 3 rifle companies were all deployed in a north-south line, with the weapons company acting as a close reserve. The 2 southernmost companies were firmly linked, but when the 3rd company had moved to the north to relieve the 2nd Battalion 8th Marines, they had to cross the airfield's runway, open ground that was so exposed they could not dig in there. This left a gap between Jones's companies. At 19:30, a group of 50 Japanese infantry began probing the battalion's defences. They found the gap between the 2 companies and began exploiting it. As rifle and machine gun fire broke the dark silence, Major Jones began to react. He immediately ordered his reserve, a couple of platoons from his headquarters and weapons companies, to patch the gap and kill any enemy that had penetrated the line. As the men advanced in the darkness, they engaged in brutal, close-ranged battle with small groups of Japanese infantry, including a bayonet charge. Simultaneously, Jones brought down a heavy artillery barrage right across his front line, just 70 meters to its front. This effectively created a defensive shield, a wall of high explosive that stopped the main Japanese attack before it had begun. 2 hours later, the Japanese probed the line again. Attacking in platoon strength, they assaulted the line with automatic weapon and mortar fire, trying to determine the location of the machine gun positions, but this was relatively easily broken up by mortar and rifle. In response, Jones requested naval gunfire to land in the main approaches to his lines, which continued throughout the night. At 3 a.m, a number of Japanese machine guns opened up on A Company's fighting positions, and for about an hour, kept up a steady rate of fire. In the darkness, it was totally inaccurate, although it did keep the men's heads down. At 4 a.m, they made their main effort. Around 300 men attacked B Company's line in a well-organised assault. It was met with withering machine gun fire and another heavy artillery bombardment. The artillery observers brought the 105mm fire to within 50 meters of the front lines, creating a wall of supersonic shell splinters and shrapnel through which the Japanese infantry had to advance. By 5 a.m, the attack had been repulsed with light casualties. In front of the Marines' fighting positions were 200 dead Japanese men, with evidence that a further 150 had been blown to pieces by the naval bombardment. This was the last act of defiance. Although there were still Japanese soldiers on Betio, their will was broken. Undoubtedly their best and bravest fighting men fell in the final counterattack. The garrison was always a force of 2 halves, a corps of elite Marines, some well-trained base units, and a number of construction workers. As Jones's battalion was repulsing the Japanese counterattack, the fresh 3rd Battalion 6th Marines moved up to its rear. Their orders were to attack and clear the remainder of the island. At 8 a.m, they moved through Jones's lines. The defeated Japanese garrison only put up 1 moment of resistance, holding a number of pillboxes 350 meters beyond the end of the airstrip. But the battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Kenneth F. McLeod, simply bypassed this area and continued advancing. By 1:30, they had reached the far eastern tip of the island. 475 Japanese men were reportedly killed that morning. Back at Red Beach 2, the strong point was finally reduced, but it took a regimental attack to do it. The 1st Battalion 8th Marines and the 3rd Battalion 2nd Marines had joined to form a semicircular attack upon the position on the boundary between Red Beaches 1 and 2. Supported by the direct fire of a pair of self-propelled 75mm anti-tank guns, a platoon of the 1st Battalion waded out onto the reef and attacked from the water. Under the cover of the big guns, they approached the last position, a concrete heavy-caliber weapon pillbox. This one defensive feature proved to be the backbone of the strongpoint. It was reduced with flamethrowers and demolition charges. After this position had fallen, Japanese resistance broke, and although mopping up continued for some time, Red Beaches 1 and 2 were finally connected. It is somewhat fitting that this strong point was the last on the whole island to fall. It had been so well sited and constructed, and so gallantly held, that it alone had put the entire operation in doubt. But in the end, the bravery and skill of the Marines was simply too much for even defences of this quality. The Battle of Tarawa was over, and the Marines were victorious. Truly, the bravery, esprit de corps, and fighting spirit of the 2nd Marine Division cannot be overstated. They had overcome a set of natural and constructed defences that made Tarawa one of the most heavily fortified places on Earth. Facing disaster on D-Day, their recovery and commitment to the battle are nothing but impressive, especially after the nightmare most of them had faced just trying to land on Betio. The battle was also another example of how good the Japanese were in defence. Although the quality of their forces on Betio was a little patchy, their elite elements, especially the Japanese Marines, fought with the utmost ferocity, bravery and commitment. Men who almost to a rule died at their posts. Another often overlooked Japanese strength is their engineers. The tiny island of Betio was subjected to an air and naval bombardment of gargantuan proportions. Yet, generally speaking, the Japanese facilities were constructed so stoutly that they simply shrugged off the abuse. As they had shown all throughout the war, Japanese engineers were capable of constructing defences, often out of nothing more than coconut logs, that were nearly impregnable to infantry and their small arms. Armour and massive fire support was, generally speaking, a minimum requirement for engaging these defensive systems. Nonetheless, many mistakes were made, both in preparing for the operation and in its execution. Some were understandable. Colonel Shoop's decision to continue landing forces on Red Beach 2 and his focus on reducing the Red Beach 1 strongpoint were costly errors. One can certainly understand his reasoning. His regiment was completely disordered, and that Japanese position stood like a wedge between his formations, effectively leaving one of his battalions isolated and vulnerable to a counterattack. As a general rule of thumb, during an amphibious landing, you want to connect your beachheads as quickly as possible, allowing for mutual support, mass, and coordination between your forces, preventing defeat in detail. However, the reality facing the Marines on D+1 was that finding a secure and safe landing area was much more important than reducing that strongpoint. This is especially true after the Japanese had shown their unwillingness or inability to launch a large-scale counterattack. Persisting in landing forces under its murderous fire, who had to wade ashore, and then throwing company after company at the position where no appreciable ground had been made, was simply wasteful. Indeed, he diverted forces that were going to try and establish a new beachhead. Stubbornness in a battlefield commander can be both a strength and a weakness, and here it was not Shoop's best trait. That being said, his general handling of the desperate situation his regiment found itself in on D-Day was good. A time where that bloody-minded drive to achieve his mission was certainly an asset. Considering how important the establishment of a safe landing area was, one cannot say enough about Major Mike Ryan and the Scratch battalion he led. All of them had experienced true horror while landing on Red Beach 1, wading through 1,000 meters of waist-deep water dominated by fire so savage that literally half of the men who landed in the first waves became casualties, many of them killed. After that ordeal, Ryan's men had found a small piece of safe, defensible ground on the northwestern tip of the island, a very rare thing on Betio. They were cut off from the rest of the regiment by that murderous strongpoint, and had no radio communications with any friendly forces. Simply holding their ground would have been completely understandable, indeed expected, but Ryan chose to attack. With the 2 tanks that actually made it ashore, his reconnaissance in force on D-Day revealed the possibility of using Green Beach, and the attack he made on D+1 was quite literally the decisive moment of the battle. With Green Beach secured, reinforcements could, for the first time in the battle, be landed without facing immediate immolation by Japanese machine gun. When Major Jones's 1st Battalion landed on Green Beach, rather than being instantaneously consumed with caring for their own casualties and redressing the inevitable confusion wading ashore would impose, they were ready to attack. Jones's battalion alone drove clear across the island, and its effectiveness is in no small measure explained by the fact that it was spared the ordeal of wading through a hailstorm of Japanese 13mm and medium machine gun fire. Once Green Beach was open, the battle was no longer in doubt, and that development can be placed squarely on the shoulders of Michael P. Ryan of Osage City, Kansas, who was awarded the Navy Cross for his actions on Betio. Despite the heroics of men like Ryan, Bonnyman, and countless other Marines whose stories we do not know, many mistakes were made at Tarawa, errors that would cost the 2nd Marine Division 1,009 killed and 2,101 wounded. Many of these were common to Operation Galvanic as a whole, but the guardsmen on Makin were spared the worst consequences of these decisions. The most glaring and catastrophic error was the misreading of the tides. Almost everything that went wrong at Tarawa can be connected back to this one simple fact. On the 20th and 21st of November, there was not enough water over the reef to allow the use of the bulk of the available landing craft. This had 2 devastating implications. The most obvious was the fact that the 4th and 5th waves, and in fact most of the follow-on forces, had to wade ashore under heavy and accurate automatic fire. At some places this distance was over a mile. This state of affairs almost guaranteed that when these men actually landed on the beach, where they were supposed to begin fighting, their strength and morale would be almost shattered. On Red Beach 1, L Company of the 3rd Battalion, as an example, had suffered 35% casualties before any of them had touched dry land. One can only imagine the mental state of the men after an ordeal like that. The second disastrous impact of the low water was the lack of armoured support for the attacking waves. Tank infantry tactics were absolutely essential when facing fixed defences as formidable as these, and if the first waves were going to have any chance of advancing beyond the seawall, they desperately needed armoured support. But those tanks, just like the reserve companies, were stranded like beached whales hundreds of metres out to sea. Only a handful made it to shore. Ryan's success on D-Day was in no small part due to the fact that he had a couple of M4 Shermans with him, and had these been able to actually land on the beaches as intended, events may have been very different indeed. What makes this mistake all the more damning is the probability of low water over the reef was understood and communicated by some elements of Navy intelligence, but this information was either missed or ignored. This was a criminal oversight. Had the operation been postponed by a week and launched on a spring tide, this whole problem could have been averted, at least for the landing waves. There were also problems with the preliminary bombardment. Many of the US Navy officers were convinced that the destructive power at their disposal would obliterate the island. One can understand why they became impressed by their own capability. 3,000 tons of naval shells, both 14 and 16 inch, were expended on Betio, not to mention the attention of hundreds of aircraft. This colossal display of firepower, especially when concentrated over such a small area, was surely impressive to those aboard ship. Many were confident that the majority of the defensive installations would have been physically destroyed by such a bombardment. But this was also a mistake. Yes, the preliminary bombardment was of some value, especially in the destruction of Japanese communications, but almost universally, the main Japanese defences were left nearly unscathed. What was far more important than the destructive effect of the bombardment was the cover it provided to the landing forces. To put it succinctly, suppression was more important than physical destruction. Just as many Entente officers of the Great War had found, artillery, no matter how impressive, was usually not enough to destroy well-concealed and well-camouflaged fortifications. Your enemy can always simply dig deeper. The advent of air power had really not changed this metric. What was far more important was keeping the defenders pinned inside their holes and shelters as your assaulting forces approached their objectives. This feature of 20th century warfare is glaringly apparent at Tarawa. Although there was a very stout strong point on the flank of Red Beach 3 near the Burns Phillip Wharf, the assaulting waves made it to shore almost unscathed. The difference between this landing beach and the others was night and day. They may as well have been assaulting another island. What explains the difference between the 3 beaches was that on Red Beach 3 there was a pair of destroyers that had moved into the edge of the reef. From this position, just offshore, they were able to drench the landing beach in fire, suppressing the defences as the LVTs lumbered across the reef. When they lifted their fire, the assaulting waves were just 7 minutes from landfall. This makes Admiral Hill's order to cease the naval bombardment more than 20 minutes before the actual H-hour all the more questionable in hindsight. This delay gave the Japanese defenders ample time to gather themselves, move to their fighting positions, and await the onslaught. Essentially, the fire of 2 destroyers was more valuable than 3 mighty battleships because that fire was available at the critical moment. Again, Admiral Hill's decision is somewhat understandable given the circumstances, but the lack of close-range destroyer support for all 3 landing beaches was a fundamental weakness of the fire support plan. But beyond the issues with operational planning and execution lies a more fundamental mistake. One has to wonder why Tarawa itself was selected as the operational objective given to the 2nd Marine Division. The strategic objective of Operation Galvanic, indeed the fundamental rationale which underpinned the whole Pacific War, was never the destruction of all Japanese forces. In fact, many Japanese garrisons on other atolls and islands such as Nauru were simply bypassed. The objective was the construction of air and naval bases in the islands. Once local air superiority had been achieved, the other Japanese garrisons would be left impotent, cut off from resupply, and stranded without air and naval assets. Tarawa, as it would prove, was one of the most heavily defended islands in the area. Surely, if there were any candidates for bypass and containment, Betio was one. Many of the same mistakes made at Tarawa were present at Makin, but these were simply far less important because the Japanese garrison and their fortifications were so much weaker. Obviously, with the comfortable view of hindsight, it is easy to be critical of many aspects of the planning and decision-making that underpinned Operation Galvanic. In fact, many of these mistakes were understandable given the circumstances. The analysis given here is not intended to simply be critical for critique's sake. The mistakes and errors made at Tarawa were foundational learning experiences upon which the United States' future amphibious doctrine was built. Understanding these mistakes is critical in understanding the reasons for future success. But perhaps a more fundamental point that the American experience at Tarawa revealed is just how difficult amphibious operations are. A defending force holding a beach line always has a tremendous defensive advantage, as the water is, by definition, a cleared kill zone. Disembarking forces under fire is always an extremely hazardous and difficult undertaking, and a simple misunderstanding of the local tides almost brought catastrophe and defeat upon the Marines at Tarawa. That kind of complexity is really something unique to amphibious operations. Yes, in land battles, weather can obviously play a role. The timing of an offensive to coordinate with the freezing of the ground in the Soviet Union obviously comes to mind. But to have a whole operation teeter on a knife edge simply because the wrong period in a 2-week cycle was selected really underlines the difficulty of these kinds of offensives. This says nothing of the logistical complexity required. The fact that the United States military-made amphibious operations look so easy later in the war really is testament to their improving skill and expertise in amphibious warfare and the development of amphibious doctrine through 1943 and 1944. The drive across the Central Pacific had got off to a victorious, though bloody, start. Although it was problematic, Operation Galvanic was clearly a US victory, one with real strategic significance. The outer Japanese perimeter had been successfully breached, and the Marshall Islands would fall next. The nightmare of Tarawa would not be the last taste of Hellfire for the Marines of the 2nd Division. Their legacy would be scored into the annals of military history at places with names like Saipan, Tinian, and Okinawa. In fact, they had begun the drive that would bring the United States to the Mariana Islands, a position from which the 20th Air Force would wreak utter destruction upon Japan. But before that ultimate objective could be reached, the great naval base at Truk had to be isolated and bypassed. Kwajalein, Eniwetok, Palau, Saipan, Guam, and Tinian would all have to be taken before that decisive air campaign could be waged, and each would extract their own toll of blood and sacrifice.